The Expedition of Humphry Clinker. By Tobias Smollett. To Sir Watkin Phillips Bart. Of Jesus College, Uxon. Dear Phillips, in my last I treated you with a high-flavoured dish, in the character of the Scotch lieutenant, and I must present him once more for your entertainment. It was our fortune to feed upon him the best part of 3 days, and I do not doubt that he will start again in our way before we shall have finished our northern excursion. The day after our meeting with him at Turin proved so tempestuous that we did not choose to proceed on our journey, and my uncle persuaded him to stay till the weather should clear up, giving him, at the same time, a general invitation to our mess. The man has certainly gathered a whole budget of shrewd observations, but he brings them forth in such an ungracious manner as would be extremely disgusting, if it was not marked by that characteristic oddity which never fails to attract the attention. He and Mr. Bramble discoursed, and even disputed, on different subjects in war, policy, the belles lettres, law, and metaphysics, and sometimes they were warmed into such altercation as seemed to threaten an abrupt dissolution of their society. But Mr. Bramble set a guard over his own irascibility, the more vigilantly as the officer was his guest, and when, in spite of all his efforts, he began to wax warm, the other prudently cooled in the same proportion. Mrs. Tabitha chancing to accost her brother by the familiar diminutive of Matt, "Pray, sir," said the lieutenant, "is your name Matthias? You must know it is one of our uncle's foibles to be ashamed of his name Matthew, because it is puritanical," and this question chagrined him so much, that he answered, "No, by God," in a very abrupt tone of displeasure. The Scot took umbrage at the manner of his reply, and bristling up, "If I had known," said he, "that you did not care to tell your name, I should not have asked the question. The lady called you Matt, and I naturally thought it was Matthias : perhaps, it may be, Methuselah, or Metrodorus, or Metellus, or Mathurinus, or Malthinus, or Matamoris, or—" "No," cried my uncle laughing, "it is neither of those, Captain. My name is Matthew Bramble, at your service. The truth is, have a foolish pique at the name of Matthew, because it favours of those canting hypocrites, who, in Cromwell's time, christened all their children by names taken from the Scripture." "A foolish pique indeed," cried Mrs. Tabby, "and even sinful, to fall out with your name because it is taken from Holy Writ. I would have you to know, you was called after great uncle Matthew ap Madicap Meredith, Esquire, of Landwest Inn, in Montgomeryshire, Justice of the Quorum, and Crusty Ruddley Oram, a gentleman of great worth and property, descended in a straight line, by the female side, from Llewellyn, Prince of Wales." This genealogical anecdote seemed to make some impression upon the North Briton, who bowed very low to the descendant of Llewellyn, and observed that he himself had the honour of a scriptural nomination. The lady expressing a desire of knowing his address, he said, he designed himself Lieutenant Obadiah Lismahago, and in order to assist her memory, he presented her with a slip of paper inscribed with these 3 words, which she repeated with great emphasis, declaring, it was one of the most noble and sonorous names she had ever heard. He observed that Obadiah was an adventitious appellation, derived from his great-grandfather, who had been one of the original Covenanters, but Lismahago was the family surname, taken from a place in Scotland so called. He likewise dropped some hints about the antiquity of his pedigree, adding, with a smile of self-denial, "St genus et proavos, et quo non fecimus ipsi, vixie nostra voco," which quotation he explained in deference to the ladies, and Mrs. Tabitha did not fail to compliment him on his modesty in waiving the merit of his ancestry, adding, that it was the less necessary to him, as he had such a considerable fund of his own. She now began to glue herself to his favour with the grossest adulation. She expatiated upon the antiquity and virtues of the Scottish nation, upon their valour, probity, learning, and politeness. She even descended to encomiums on his own personal address, his gallantry, good sense, and erudition. She appealed to her brother, whether the captain was not the very image of our cousin Governor Griffith. she discovered a surprising eagerness to know the particulars of his life, and asked 1,000 questions concerning his achievements in war, all which Mr. Lismahago answered with a sort of Jesuitical reserve, affecting a reluctance to satisfy her curiosity on a subject that concerned his own exploits. By dint of her interrogations, however, we learned that he and Ensign Murphy had made their escape from the French hospital at Montreal, and taken to the woods, in hope of reaching some English settlement, but mistaking their route, they fell in with a party of Miamis, who carried them away in captivity. The intention of these Indians was to give one of them as an adopted son to a venerable sachem, who had lost his own in the course of the war, and to sacrifice the other according to the custom of the country. Murphy, as being the younger and handsomer of the two, was designed to fill the place of the deceased, not only as the son of the sachem, but as the spouse of a beautiful squaw, to whom his predecessor had been betrothed. But in passing through the different wigwams or villages of the Miamis, poor Murphy was so mangled by the women and children, who have the privilege of torturing all prisoners in their passage, that, by the time they arrived at the place of the sachem's residence, he was rendered altogether unfit for the purposes of marriage. It was determined therefore, in the assembly of the warriors, that Ensign Murphy should be brought to the stake, and that the lady should be given to Lieutenant Lismahago, who had likewise received his share of torments, though they had not produced emasculation. A joint of one finger had been cut, or rather sawed off with a rusty knife, one of his great toes was crushed into a mash betwixt two stones, some of his teeth were drawn, or dug out with a crooked nail, splintered reeds had been thrust up his nostrils and other tender parts, and the calves of his legs had been blown up, with mines of gunpowder dug in the flesh with the sharp point of the tomahawk. The Indians themselves allowed that Murphy died with great heroism, singing, as his death song, the Dremendu, in concert with Mr. Lismahago, who was present at the solemnity. After the warriors and the matrons had made a hearty meal upon the muscular flesh which they pared from the victim, and had applied a great variety of tortures, which he bore without flinching, an old lady, with a sharp knife, scooped out one of his eyes, and put a burning coal in the socket. The pain of this operation was so exquisite that he could not help bellowing, upon which the audience raised a shout of exultation, and one of the warriors stealing behind him, gave him the coup de grace with a hatchet. Lismahago's bride, the squaw Squinkanacusta, distinguished herself on this occasion. She showed a great superiority of genius in the tortures which she contrived and executed with her own hands. She vied with the stoutest warrior in kneading the flesh of the sacrifice, and after all the other females were fuddled with dram drinking, she was not so intoxicated but that she was able to play the game of the platter with the conjuring sachem, and afterwards go through the ceremony of her own wedding, which was consummated that same evening. The captain had lived very happily with this accomplished squaw for 2 years, during which she bore him a son, who is now the representative of his mother's tribe, but, at length, to his unspeakable grief, she had died of a fever, occasioned by eating too much raw bear, which they had killed in a hunting excursion. By this time, Mr. Lismahago was elected sachem, acknowledged first warrior of the Badger tribe, and dignified with the name or epithet of a Kakanastagorora, which signifies nimble as a weasel, but all these advantages and honors he was obliged to resign, in consequence of being exchanged for the orator of the community, who had been taken prisoner by the Indians, that were in alliance with the English. At the peace, he had sold out upon half pay, and was returned to Britain, with a view to pass the rest of his life in his own country, where he hoped to find some retreat where his slender finances would afford him a decent subsistence. Such are the outlines of Mr. Lismahago's history, to which Tabitha did seriously incline her ear. Indeed, she seemed to be taken with the same charms that captivated the heart of Desdemona, who loved the more for the dangers he had passed. The description of poor Murphy's sufferings, which threw my sister Lydia into a swoon, extracted some sighs from the breast of Mrs. Tabby. When she understood he had been rendered unfit for marriage, she began to spit, and ejaculated, "Jesus, what cruel barbarians!" and she made dry faces at the lady's nuptial repast, but she was eagerly curious to know the particulars of her marriage dress, whether she wore high-breasted stays or bodice, a robe of silk or velvet, and laces of Mechlin or mignonette. She supposed, as they were connected with the French, she used rouge, and had her hair dressed in the Parisian fashion. The captain would have declined giving a categorical explanation of all these particulars, observing, in general, that the Indians were too tenacious of their own customs to adopt the modes of any nation whatsoever, he said, moreover, that neither the simplicity of their manners nor the commerce of their country would admit of those articles of luxury which are deemed magnificence in Europe, and that they were too virtuous and sensible to encourage the introduction of any fashion which might help to render them corrupt and effeminate. These observations served only to inflame her desire of knowing the particulars about which she had inquired, and, with all his evasion, he could not help discovering the following circumstances: that his princess had neither shoes, stockings, shift, nor any kind of linen, that her bridal dress consisted of a petticoat of red baize, and a fringed blanket, fastened about her shoulders with a copper skewer, but of ornaments she had great plenty. Her hair was curiously plaited, and interwoven with bobbins of human bone, one eyelid was painted green, and the other yellow, the cheeks were blue, the lips white, the teeth red, and there was a black list drawn down the middle of the forehead as far as the tip of the nose. A couple of gaudy parrot's feathers were stuck through the division of the nostrils, there was a blue stone set in the chin, her earrings consisted of 2 pieces of hickory, of the size and shape of drumsticks, her arms and legs were adorned with bracelets of wampum, her breast glittered with numerous strings of glass beads, she wore a curious pouch, or pocket of woven grass, elegantly painted with various colors. About her neck was hung the fresh scalp of a Mohawk warrior, whom her deceased lover had lately slain in battle, and, finally, she was anointed from head to foot with bear's grease, which sent forth a most agreeable odor. One would imagine that these paraphernalia would not have been much admired by a modern fine lady, but Mrs. Tabitha was resolved to approve of all the captain's connections. She wished, indeed, the squire had been better provided with linen, but she owned there was much taste and fancy in her ornaments. She made no doubt, therefore, that Madame Squinkanacusta was a young lady of good sense and rare accomplishments, and a good Christian at bottom. Then she asked whether his consort had been High Church or Low Church, Presbyterian or Anabaptist, or had been favored with any glimmering of the new light of the gospel. When he confessed that she and her whole nation were utter strangers to the Christian faith, she gazed at him with signs of astonishment, and Humphry Clinker, who chanced to be in the room, uttered a hollow groan. After some pause, "In the name of God, Captain Lismahago," cried she, "what religion do they profess?" "As to religion, madam," answered the lieutenant, "it is among those Indians a matter of great simplicity. They never heard of any alliance between church and state. They, in general, worship 2 contending principles, one the fountain of all good, the other the source of all evil. The common people there, as in other countries, run into the absurdities of superstition, but sensible men pay adoration to a supreme being, who created and sustains the universe." "Oh! What pity," exclaimed the pious Tabby, "that some holy man has not been inspired to go and convert these poor heathens." The lieutenant told her, that while he resided among them, 2 French missionaries arrived, in order to convert them to the Catholic religion, but when they talked of mysteries and revelations, which they could neither explain nor authenticate, and called in the evidence of miracles which they believed upon hearsay, when they taught that the supreme Creator of heaven and earth had allowed his only Son, his own equal in power and glory, to enter the bowels of a woman, to be born as a human creature, to be insulted, flagellated, and even executed as a malefactor; when they pretended to create God himself, to swallow, digest, revive, and multiply him ad infinitum, by the help of a little flour and water, the Indians were shocked at the impiety of their presumption. They were examined by the assembly of the sachems, who desired them to prove the divinity of their mission by some miracle. They answered, that it was not in their power. If you were really sent by heaven for our conversion, said one of the sachems, you would certainly have some supernatural endowments, at least you would have the gift of tongues, in order to explain your doctrine to the different nations among which you are employed, but you are so ignorant of our language, that you cannot express yourselves even on the most trifling subjects. In a word, the assembly were convinced of their being cheats, and even suspected them of being spies. They ordered them a bag of Indian corn apiece, and appointed a guide to conduct them to the frontiers, but the missionaries, having more zeal than discretion, refused to quit the vineyard. They persisted in saying Mass, in preaching, baptizing, and squabbling with the conjurers, or priests of the country, till they had thrown the whole community into confusion. Then the assembly proceeded to try them as impious impostors, who represented the Almighty as a trifling, weak, capricious being, and pretended to make, unmake, and reproduce him at pleasure. They were, therefore, convicted of blasphemy and sedition, and condemned to the stale, where they died singing Salve Regina, in a rapture of joy, for the crown of martyrdom which they had thus obtained. In the course of this conversation, Lieutenant Lismahago dropped some hints by which it appeared he himself was a free thinker. Our aunt seemed to be startled at certain sarcasms he threw out against the creed of St. Athanasius. He dwelt much upon the words, reason, philosophy, and contradiction in terms. He bid defiance to the eternity of hellfire, and even threw such squibs at the immortality of the soul, as singed a little the whiskers of Mrs. Tabitha's faith, for, by this time she began to look upon Lismahago as a prodigy of learning and sagacity. In short, he could be no longer insensible to the advances she made towards his affection, and although there was something repulsive in his nature, he overcame it so far as to make some return to her civilities. Perhaps, he thought it would be no bad scheme, in a superannuated lieutenant on half-pay, to effect a conjunction with an old maid, who, in all probability, had fortune enough to keep him easy and comfortable in the fag end of his days. An ogling correspondence forthwith commenced between this amiable pair of originals. He began to sweeten the natural acidity of his discourse with a treacle of compliment and commendation. He from time to time offered her snuff, of which he himself took great quantities, and even made her a present of a purse of silk grass, woven by the hands of the amiable Squinkanacusta, who had used it as a shot pouch in her hunting expeditions. From Doncaster northwards, all the windows of all the inns are scrawled with doggerel rhymes, in abuse of the Scotch nation, and what surprised me very much, I did not perceive one line written in the way of recrimination. Curious to hear what Lismahago would say on this subject, I pointed out to him a very scurrilous epigram against his countrymen, which was engraved on one of the windows of the parlor where we sat. He read it with the most starched composure, and when I asked his opinion of the poetry, "It is vara terse and vara poignant," said he, "but with the help of a Waddish clout, it might be rendered more clear and perspicuous." I marvel much that some modern wit has not published a collection of these essays under the title of The Glazier's Triumph over Sawney the Scot. I'm persuaded it would be a very agreeable offering to the patriots of London and Westminster. When I expressed some surprise that the natives of Scotland, who travel this way, had not broke all the windows upon the road, with submission, replied the lieutenant, that were but shallow policy, it would only serve to make the satire more cutting and severe, and I think it is much better to let it stand in the window, than have it presented in the reckoning. My uncle's jaws began to quiver with indignation. He said, the scribblers of such infamous stuff deserved to be scourged at the cart's tail for disgracing their country with such monuments of malice and stupidity. These vermin, said he, do not consider that they are affording their fellow subjects, whom they abuse, continual matter of self-gratulation, as well as the means of executing the most manly vengeance that can be taken for such low, a liberal attacks. For my part, I admire the philosophic forbearance of the Scots, as much as I despise the insolence of those wretched libellers, which is akin to the arrogance of the village cock, who never crows but upon his own dunghill. The captain, with an affectation of candour, observed, that men of illiberal minds were produced in every soil, that in supposing those were the sentiments of the English in general, he should pay too great a compliment to his own country, which was not of consequence enough to attract the envy of such a flourishing and powerful people. Mrs. Tabby broke forth again in praise of his moderation, and declared that Scotland was the soil which produced every virtue under heaven. When Lismahago took his leave for the night, she asked her brother if the captain was not the prettiest gentleman he had ever seen, and whether there was not something wonderfully engaging in his aspect. Mr. Bramble having eyed her some time in silence, "Sister," said he, "the lieutenant is, for aught I know, an honest man and a good officer. He has a considerable share of understanding, and a title to more encouragement than he seems to have met with in life, but I cannot, with a safe conscience, affirm that he is the prettiest gentleman I ever saw, neither can I discern any engaging charm in his countenance, which, I vow to God, is, on the contrary, very hard-favoured and forbidding. I have endeavoured to ingratiate myself with this North Briton, who is really a curiosity, but he has been very shy of my conversation ever since I laughed at his asserting that the English tongue was spoke with more propriety at Edinburgh than at London. Looking at me with a double squeeze of souring in his aspect, "If the old definition be true," said he, "that risibility is the distinguishing characteristic of a rational creature, the English are the most distinguished for rationality of any people I ever knew." I owned that the English were easily struck with anything that appeared ludicrous, and apt to laugh accordingly, but it did not follow that, because they were more given to laughter, they had more rationality than their neighbours. I said, such an inference would be an injury to the Scots, who were by no means defective in rationality, though generally supposed little subject to the impressions of humour. The captain answered, that this supposition must have been deduced either from their conversation or their compositions, of which the English could not possibly judge with precision, as they did not understand the dialect used by the Scots in common discourse, as well as in their works of humour. When I desired to know what those works of humour were, he mentioned a considerable number of pieces, which he insisted were equal in point of humour to anything extant in any language dead or living. He, in particular, recommended a collection of detached poems, in 2 small volumes, intituled The Evergreen, and the works of Allan Ramsay, which I intend to provide myself with at Edinburgh. He observed that a North Briton is seen to a disadvantage in an English company, because he speaks in a dialect that they can't relish, and in a phraseology which they don't understand. He therefore finds himself under a restraint, which is a great enemy to wit and humour. These are faculties which never appear in full lustre, but when the mind is perfectly at ease, and, as an excellent writer says, enjoys her elbow room. He proceeded to explain his assertion that the English language was spoken with greater propriety at Edinburgh than in London. He said, what we generally called the Scottish dialect was, in fact, true, genuine Old English, with a mixture of some French terms and idioms, adopted in a long intercourse betwixt the French and Scotch nations, that the modern English, from affectation and false refinement, had weakened, and even corrupted their language, by throwing out the guttural sounds, altering the pronunciation and the quantity, and disusing many words and terms of great significance. In consequence of these innovations, the works of our best poets, such as Chaucer, Spenser, and even Shakespeare, were become, in many parts, unintelligible to the natives of South Britain, whereas the Scots, who retain the ancient language, understand them without the help of a glossary. For instance, said he, how have your commentators been puzzled by the following expression in The Tempest, he's gentle and not fearful, as if it was a paralogism to say, that being gentle, he must of course be courageous, but the truth is, one of the original meanings, if not the sole meaning, of that word was, noble, high-minded, and to this day, a Scotchwoman, in the situation of the young lady in The Tempest, would express herself nearly in the same terms. Don't provoke him, for being gentle, that is, high-spirited, he won't tamely bear an insult. Spenser, in the very first stanza of his Fairy Queen, says, "A gentle knight was pricking on the plain, which knight, far from being tame and fearful, was so stout that nothing did he dread, but ever was dread." To prove that we had impaired the energy of our language by false refinement, he mentioned following words, which, though widely different in signification, are pronounced exactly in the same manner: right, 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 but among the Scots, these words are as different in pronunciation as they are in meaning and orthography, and this is the case with many others which he mentioned by way of illustration. He, moreover, took notice that we had, for what reason he could never learn, altered the sound of our vowels from that which is retained by all the nations in Europe, an alteration which rendered the language extremely difficult to foreigners, and made it almost impracticable to lay down general rules for orthography and pronunciation. Besides, the vowels were no longer simple sounds in the mouth of an Englishman, who pronounced both I and U as diphthongs. Finally, he affirmed that we mumbled our speech with our lips and teeth, and ran the words, together without pause or distinction, in such a manner, that a foreigner, though he understood English tolerably well, was often obliged to have recourse to a Scotchman to explain what a native of England had said in his own language. The truth of this remark was confirmed by Mr. Bramble from his own experience, but he accounted for it on another principle. He said, the same observation would hold, in all languages, that a Swiss talking French was more easily understood than a Parisian, by a foreigner who had not made himself master of the language, because every language had its peculiar recitative, and it would always require more pains, attention, and practice, to acquire both the words and the music, than to learn the words only, and yet nobody would deny that the one was imperfect without the other. He therefore apprehended that the Scotchman and the Swiss were better understood by learners, because they spoke the words only, without the music, which they could not rehearse. One would imagine this check might have damped the North Briton, but it served only to agitate his humor for disputation. He said, if every nation had its own recitative or music, the Scots had theirs, and the Scotchman who had not yet acquired the cadence of the English, would naturally use his own in speaking their language. Therefore, if he was better understood than the native, his recitative must be more intelligible than that of the English. Of consequence, the dialect of the Scots had an advantage over that of their fellow subjects, and this was another strong presumption that the modern English had corrupted their language in the article of pronunciation. The lieutenant was, by this time, become so polemical, that every time he opened his mouth out flew a paradox, which he maintained with all the enthusiasm of altercation, but all his paradoxes favored strong of a partiality for his own country. He undertook to prove that poverty was a blessing to a nation, that oatmeal was preferable to wheat flour, and that the worship of Closina, in temples which admitted both sexes, and every rank of votaries promiscuously, was a filthy species of idolatry that outraged every idea of delicacy and decorum. I did not so much wonder at his broaching these doctrines, as at the arguments, equally whimsical and ingenious, which he adduced in support of them. In fine, Lieutenant Lismahago is a curiosity which I have not yet sufficiently perused, and therefore I shall be sorry when we lose his company, though, God knows, there is nothing very amiable in his manner or disposition. As he goes directly to the southwest division of Scotland, and we proceed in the road to Berwick, we shall part tomorrow at a place called Felton Bridge, and, I dare say, this separation will be very grievous to our Aunt Mrs. Tabitha, unless she has received some flattering assurance of his meeting her again. If I fail in my purpose of entertaining you with these unimportant occurrences, they will at least serve as exercises of patience, for which you are indebted to yours always, J. To Dr. Lewis. Dear Doctor, I have now reached the northern extremity of England, and see, close to my chamber window, the Tweed gliding through the arches of that bridge which connects this suburb to the town of Berwick. Yorkshire you have seen, and therefore I shall say nothing of that opulent province. The city of Durham appears like a confused heap of stones and brick, accumulated so as to cover a mountain, round which a river winds its brawling course. The streets are generally narrow, dark, and unpleasant, and many of them almost impassable in consequence of their declivity. The cathedral is a huge gloomy pile, but the clergy are well lodged, the bishop lives in a princely manner, the golden prebends keep plentiful tables, and, I am told, there is some good sociable company in the place. But the country, when viewed from the top of Gateshead Fell, which extends to Newcastle, exhibits the highest scene of cultivation that ever I beheld. As for Newcastle, it lies mostly in a bottom, on the banks of the Tyne, and makes an appearance still more disagreeable than that of Durham, but it is rendered populous and rich by industry and commerce, and the country lying on both sides the river, above the town, yields a delightful prospect of agriculture and plantation. Morpeth and Alnwick are neat, pretty towns, and this last is famous for the castle which has belonged so many ages to the noble house of Piercy, Earls of Northumberland. It is, doubtless, a large edifice, containing a great number of apartments, and stands in a commanding situation, but the strength of it seems to have consisted not so much in its site, or the manner in which it is fortified, as in the valor of its defendants. Our adventures since we left Scarborough are scarce worth reciting, and yet I must make you acquainted with my sister Tabby's progress in husband hunting, after her disappointments at Bath and London. She had actually begun to practice upon a certain adventurer, who was in fact a highwayman by profession, but he had been used to snares much more dangerous than any she could lay, and escaped accordingly. Then she opened her batteries upon an old weather-beaten Scotch lieutenant, called Lismahago, who joined us at Durham, and is, I think, one of the most singular personages I ever encountered. His manner is as harsh as his countenance, but his peculiar turn of thinking, and his pack of knowledge made up of the remnants of rarities, rendered his conversation desirable, in spite of his pedantry and ungracious address. I have often met with a crab-apple in a hedge, which I have been tempted to eat for its flavor, even while I was disgusted by its austerity. The spirit of contradiction is naturally so strong in Lismahago, that I believe in my conscience he has rummaged, and read, and studied with indefatigable attention, in order to qualify himself to refute established maxims, and thus raise trophies for the gratification of polemical pride. Such is the asperity of his self-conceit, that he will not even acquiesce in a transient compliment made to his own individual in particular, or to his country in general. When I observed that he must have read a vast number of books to be able to discourse on such a variety of subjects, he declared he had read little or nothing, and asked how he should find books among the woods of America, where he had spent the greatest part of his life. My nephew remarking that the Scots in general were famous for their learning, he denied the imputation, and defied him to prove it from their works. The Scots, said he, have a slight tincture of letters, with which they make a parade among people who are more illiterate than themselves, but they may be said to float on the surface of science, and they have made very small advances in the useful arts. At least, cried Tabby, all the world allows that the Scots behaved gloriously in fighting and conquering the savages of America. I can assure you, madam, you have been misinformed, replied the lieutenant. In that continent the Scots did nothing more than their duty, nor was there one corps in His Majesty's service that distinguished itself more than another. Those who affected to extol the Scots for superior merit, were no friends to that nation. Though he himself made free with his countrymen, he would not suffer any other person to glance a sarcasm at them with impunity. One of the company chancing to mention Lord B.'s inglorious peace, the lieutenant immediately took up the cudgels in his lordship's favour, and argued very strenuously to prove that it was the most honourable and advantageous peace that England had ever made since the foundation of the monarchy. Nay, between friends, he offered such reasons on this subject, that I was really confounded, if not convinced. He would not allow that the Scots abounded above their proportion in the army and navy of Great Britain, or that the English had any reason to say his countrymen had met with extraordinary encouragement in the service. "When a South and North Briton," said he, "are competitors for a place or commission, which is in the disposal of an English minister or an English general, it would be absurd to suppose that the preference will not be given to the native of England, who has so many advantages over his rival. First and foremost, he has in his favour that laudable partiality, which, Mr. Addison says, never fails to cleave to the heart of an Englishman. Secondly, he has more powerful connections, and a greater share of parliamentary interest, by which those contests are generally decided, and lastly, he has a greater command of money to smooth the way to his success. For my own part," said he, "I know no Scotch officer, who has risen in the army above the rank of a subaltern, without purchasing every degree of preferment either with money or recruits, but I know many gentlemen of that country, who, for want of money and interest, have grown grey in the rank of lieutenants, whereas very few instances of this ill fortune are to be found among the natives of South Britain. Not that I would insinuate that my countrymen have the least reason to complain. Preferment in the service, like success in any other branch of traffic, will naturally favor those who have the greatest stock of cash and credit, merit and capacity being supposed equal on all sides. But the most hardy of all this original's positions were these, that commerce would, sooner or later, prove the ruin of every nation, where it flourishes to any extent, that the Parliament was the rotten part of the British Constitution, that the liberty of the press was a national evil, and that the boasted institution of juries, as managed in England, was productive of shameful perjury and flagrant injustice. He observed, that traffic was an enemy to all the liberal passions of the soul, founded on the thirst of lucre, a sordid disposition to take advantage of the necessities of our fellow creatures. He affirmed, the nature of commerce was such, that it could not be fixed or perpetuated, but, having flowed to a certain height, would immediately begin to ebb, and so continue till the channels should be left almost dry, but there was no instance of the tides rising a second time to any considerable influx in the same nation. Meanwhile the sudden affluence occasioned by trade, forced open all the sluices of luxury and overflowed the land with every species of profligacy and corruption. A total pravity of manners would ensue, and this must be attended with bankruptcy and ruin. He observed of the Parliament, that the practice of buying boroughs, and canvassing for votes, was an avowed system of venality, already established on the ruins of principle, integrity, faith, and good order, in consequence of which the elected and the elector, and, in short, the whole body of the people, were equally and universally contaminated and corrupted. He affirmed, that of a Parliament thus constituted, the Crown would always have influence enough to secure a great majority in its dependence, from the great number of posts, places, and pensions it had to bestow, that such a Parliament would, as it had already done, lengthen the term of its sitting and authority, whenever the Prince should think it for his interest to continue the representatives, for, without doubt, they had the same right to protect their authority ad infinitum, as they had to extend it from 3 to 7 years. With a Parliament, therefore, dependent upon the Crown, devoted to the Prince, and supported by a standing army, garbled and modelled for the purpose, any King of England may, and probably some ambitious sovereign will, totally overthrow all the bulwarks of the Constitution, for it is not to be supposed that a prince of high spirit will tamely submit to be thwarted in all his measures, abused and insulted by a populace of unbridled ferocity, when he has it in his power to crush all opposition under his feet with the concurrence of the legislature. He said, he should always consider the liberty of the press as a national evil, while it enabled the vilest reptile to soil the luster of the most shining merit, and furnished the most infamous incendiary with the means of disturbing the peace and destroying the good order of the community. He owned, however, that under due restrictions, it would be a valuable privilege, but affirmed, that at present there was no law in England sufficient to restrain it within proper bounds. With respect to juries, he expressed himself to this effect: Juries are generally composed of illiterate plebeians, apt to be mistaken, easily misled, and open to sinister influence, for if either of the parties to be tried can gain over one of the 12 jurors, he has secured the verdict in his favor. The juryman thus brought over will, in despite of all evidence and conviction, generally, hold out till his fellows are fatigued, and harassed, and starved into concurrence, in which case the verdict is unjust, and the jurors are all perjured. But cases will often occur, when the jurors are really divided in opinion, and each side is convinced in opposition to the other, but the no verdict will be received, unless they are unanimous, and they are all bound, not only in conscience, but by oath, to judge and declare according to their conviction. What then will be the consequence? They must either starve in company, or one side must sacrifice their conscience to their convenience, and join in a verdict which they believe to be false. This absurdity is avoided in Sweden, where a bare majority is sufficient, and in Scotland, where 2/3 of the jury are required to concur in the verdict. You must not imagine that all these deductions were made on his part, without contradictions on mine. No, the truth is, I found myself piqued in point of honor, at his pretending to be so much wiser than his neighbors. I questioned all his assertions, started innumerable objections, argued and wrangled with uncommon perseverance, and grew very warm, and even violent, in the debate. Sometimes he was puzzled, and once or twice, I think, fairly refuted, but from those falls he rose again, like Antaeus, with redoubled vigor, till at length I was tired, exhausted, and really did not know how to proceed, when luckily he dropped a hint, by which he discovered he had been bred to the law, a confession which enabled me to retire from the dispute with a good grace, as it could not be supposed that a man like me, who had been bred to nothing, should be able to cope with a veteran in his own profession. I believe, however, that I shall for some time continue to chew the cud of reflection upon many observations which this original discharged. Whether our sister Tabby was really struck with his conversation, or is resolved to throw at everything she meets in the shape of a man, till she can fasten the matrimonial noose, certain it is, she has taken desperate strides towards the affection of Lismahago, who cannot be said to have met her halfway, though he does not seem altogether insensible to her civilities. She insinuated more than once how happy we should be to have his company through that part of Scotland which we propose to visit, till at length he plainly told us, that his road was totally different from that which we intended to take, that, for his part, his company would be of very little service to us in our progress, as he was utterly unacquainted with the country, which he had left in his early youth. Consequently, he could neither direct us in our inquiries, nor introduce us to any family of distinction. He said, he was stimulated by an irresistible impulse to revisit the Paternus Lar, or Patria Domus, though he expected little satisfaction, inasmuch as he understood that his nephew, the present possessor, was but ill qualified to support the honor of the family. He assured us, however, as we designed to return by the west road, that he will watch our motions, and endeavor to pay his respects to us at Dumfries. Accordingly he took his leave of us at a place halfway betwixt Morpeth and Alnwick, and pranced away in great state, mounted on a tall, meagre, raw-boned, shambling grey gelding, without e'er a tooth in his head, the very counterpart of the rider, and, indeed, the appearance of the two was so picturesque, that I would give 20 guineas to have them tolerably presented on canvas. Northumberland is a fine county, extending to the Tweed, which is a pleasant pastoral stream, but you will be surprised when I tell you that the English side of that river is neither so well cultivated nor so populous as the other. The farms are thinly scattered, the lands unenclosed, and scarce a gentleman's seat is to be seen in some miles from the Tweed, whereas the Scots are advanced in crowds to the very brink of the river, so that you may reckon above 30 good houses, in the compass of a few miles, belonging to proprietors whose ancestors had fortified castles in the same situations, a circumstance that shows what dangerous neighbors the Scots must have formerly been to the northern counties of England. Our domestic economy continues on the old footing. My sister Tabby still adheres to Methodism, and had the benefit of a sermon at Wesley's meeting in Newcastle, but I believe the passion of love has in some measure abated the fervour of devotion both in her and her woman, Mrs. Jenkins, about whose good graces there has been a violent contest betwixt my nephew's valet, Mr. Dutton, and my man, Humphry Clinker. Jery has been obliged to interpose his authority to keep the peace, and to him I have left the discussion of that important affair, which had like to have kindled the flames of discord in the family of yours always, Matt. Bramble. Tweed. To Sir Watkin Phillips, Bart. At Oxon. Dear Wat, in my two last you had so much of Lismahago, that I suppose you are glad he is gone off the stage for the present. I must now descend to domestic occurrences. Love, it seems, is resolved to assert his dominion over all the females of our family. After having practised upon poor Liddy's heart, and played strange vagaries with our Aunt Mrs. Tabitha, he began to run riot in the affections of her woman, Mrs. Winifred Jenkins, whom I have had occasion to mention more than once in the course of our memoirs. Nature intended Jenkins for something very different from the character of her mistress, yet custom and habit have effected a wonderful resemblance betwixt them in many particulars. When, to be sure, is much younger and more agreeable in her person, she is likewise tender-hearted and benevolent, qualities for which her mistress is by no means remarkable, no more than she is for being of a timorous disposition, and much subject to fits of the mother, which are the infirmities of one's constitution. But then she seems to have adopted Mrs. Tabby's manner with her cast clothes. She dresses and endeavours to look like her mistress, although her own looks are much more engaging. She enters into her scheme of economy, learns her phrases, repeats her remarks, imitates her style in scolding the inferior servants, and, finally, subscribes implicitly to her system of devotion. This, indeed, she found the more agreeable, as it was in a great measure introduced and confirmed by the ministry of Clinker, with whose personal merit she seems to have been struck ever since he exhibited the pattern of his naked skin at Marlborough. Nevertheless, though Humphry had this double hank upon her inclinations, and exerted all his power to maintain the conquest he had made, he found it impossible to guard it on the side of vanity, where poor Win was as frail as any female in the kingdom. In short, my rascal Dutton professed himself her admirer, and, by dint of his outlandish qualifications, threw his rival Clinker out of the saddle of her heart. Humphry may be compared to an English pudding, composed of good wholesome flour and suet, and Dutton to a syllabub or iced froth, which, though agreeable to the taste, has nothing solid or substantial. The traitor not only dazzled her with his second-hand finery, but he fawned, and flattered, and cringed. He taught her to take rappee, and presented her with a snuff-box of papier match. He supplied her with a powder for her teeth, he mended her complexion, and he dressed her hair in the Paris fashion. He undertook to be her French master and her dancing master, as well as friseur, and thus imperceptibly wound himself into her good graces. Clinker perceived the progress he had made, and repined in secret. He attempted to open her eyes in the way of exhortation, and finding it produced no effect had recourse to prayer. At Newcastle, while he attended Mrs. Tabby to the Methodist meeting, his rival accompanied Mrs. Jenkins to the play. He was dressed in a silk coat, made at Paris for his former master, with a tawdry waistcoat of tarnished brocade. He wore his hair in a great bag with a huge solitaire, and a long sword dangled from his thigh. The lady was all of a flutter with faded lute-string, washed gauze, and ribbons 3 times refreshed, but she was most remarkable for the frisure of her head, which rose, like a pyramid, 7 inches above the scalp, and her face was primed and patched from the chin up to the eyes. Nay, the gallant himself had spared neither red nor white in improving the nature of his own complexion. In this attire, they walked together through the High Street to the theatre, and as they passed for players ready dressed for acting, they reached it unmolested. But as it was still light when they returned, and by that time the people had got information of their real character and condition, they hissed and hooted all the way, and Mrs. Jenkins was all bespattered with dirt, as well as insulted with the opprobrious name of painted Jezebel, so that her fright and mortification threw her into an hysteric fit the moment she came home. Clinker was so incensed at Dutton, whom he considered as the cause of her disgrace, that he upbraided him severely for having turned the poor woman's brain. The other affected to treat him with contempt, and mistaking his forbearance for want of courage, threatened to horsewhip him into good manners. Humphry then came to me, humbly begging I would give him leave to chastise my servant for his insolence. He has challenged me to fight him at sword's point, said he, but I might as well challenge him to make a horseshoe, or a plough iron, for I know no more of the one than he does of the other. Besides, it doth not become servants to use those weapons, or to claim the privilege of gentlemen to kill one another when they fall out. Moreover, I would not have his blood upon my conscience for 10,000 times the profit or satisfaction I should get by his death, but if your honour won't be angry, I'll engage to G in a good drubbing, that, mayhap, will do an service, and I'll take care it shall do an no harm. I said, I had no objection to what he proposed, provided he could manage matters so as not to be found the aggressor, in case Dutton should prosecute him for an assault and battery. Thus licensed, he retired, and that same evening easily provoked his rival to strike the first blow, which Clinker returned with such interest that he was obliged to call for quarter, declaring, at the same time, that he would exact severe and bloody satisfaction the moment we should pass the border, when he could run him through the body without fear of the consequence. This scene passed in presence of Lieutenant Lismahago, who encouraged Clinker to hazard a thrust of cold iron with his antagonist. Cold iron, cried Humphry, I shall never use against the life of any human creature, but I am so far from being afraid of his cold iron, that I shall use nothing in my defense but a good cudgel, which shall always be at his service. In the meantime, the fair cause of this contest, Mrs. Winifred Jenkins, seemed overwhelmed with affliction, and Mr. Clinker acted much on the reserve, though he did not presume to find fault with her conduct. The dispute between the two rivals was soon brought to a very unexpected issue. Among our fellow lodgers at Berwick, was a couple from London, bound to Edinburgh, on the voyage of matrimony. The female was the daughter and heiress of a pawnbroker deceased, who had given her guardians the slip, and put herself under the tuition of a tall Hibernian, who had conducted her thus far in quest of a clergyman to unite them in marriage, without the formalities required by the law of England. I know not how the lover had behaved on the road, so as to decline in the favour of his inamorata, but, in all probability, Dutton perceived a coldness on her side, which encouraged him to whisper, it was a pity she should have cast affections upon a tailor, which he affirmed the Irishman to be. This discovery completed her disgust, of which my man, taking the advantage, began to recommend himself to her good graces, and the smooth-tongued rascal found no difficulty to insinuate himself into the place of her heart, from which the other had been discarded. Their resolution was immediately taken. In the morning, before day, while poor Teague lay snoring abed, his indefatigable rival ordered a post-chaise, and set out with a lady for Coldstream, a few miles up the Tweed, where there was a parson who dealt in this branch of commerce, and there they were noosed, before the Irishman ever dreamt of the matter. But when he got up at 6 o'clock, and found the bird was flown, he made such a noise as alarmed the whole house. One of the first persons he encountered was the postilion returned from Coldstream, where he had been witness to the marriage, and over and above an handsome gratuity, had received a bride's favour, which he now wore in his cap. When the forsaken lover understood they were actually married, and set out for London, and that Dutton had discovered to the lady that he, the Hibernian, was a tailor, he had like to have run distracted. He tore the ribbon from the fellow's cap, and beat it about his ears. He swore he would pursue him to the gates of hell, and ordered a post-chaise and four to be got ready as soon as possible, but, recollecting that his finances would not admit of this way of travelling, he was obliged to countermand this order. For my part, I knew nothing at all of what had happened, till the postilion brought me the keys of my trunk and portmanteau, which he had received from Dutton, who sent me his respects, hoping I would excuse him for his abrupt departure, as it was a step upon which his fortune depended. Before I had time to make my uncle acquainted with this event, the Irishman burst into my chamber, without any introduction, exclaiming, "By my soul, your servant has robbed me of £5,000, and I'll have satisfaction, if I should be hanged, tomorrow." When I asked him who he was, "My name," said he, "is Master McClellan, but it should be Leland O'Neill, for I'm come from Tyrone the Great, and so I am as good a gentleman as any in Ireland, and that rogue, your servant, said I was a tailor, which was as big a lie as if he had called me the Pope. I'm a man of fortune, and have spent all I had, and so being in distress, Mr. Cosgrave, the fashioner in Suffolk Street, took me out, and made me his own private secretary. By the same token, I was the last he bailed, for his friends obliged him to tie himself up, that he would bail no more above £10, for why, because as how, he could not refuse anybody that asked, and therefore in time would have robbed himself of his whole fortune, and, if he had lived long at that rate, must have died bankrupt very soon. And so I made my addresses to Miss Skinner, a young lady of £5,000 fortune, who agreed to take me for better nor worse, and, to be sure, this day would have put me in possession, if it had not been for that rogue, your servant, who came like a thief, and stole away my property, and made her believe I was a tailor, and that she was going to marry the ninth part of a man. But the devil burn my soul, if ever I catch him on the mountains of Tilgabgly, if I don't show him that I'm 9 times as good a man as he, or e'er a bug of his country. When he had rung out his first alarm, I told him I was sorry he had allowed himself to be so jock-eyed, but it was no business of mine, and that the fellow who robbed him of his bride, had likewise robbed me of my servant. "Didn't I tell you then," cried he, "that rogue was his true Christian name? Oh, if I had but one fair trust with him upon the sod, I'd give him leave to brag all the rest of his life." My uncle, hearing the noise, came in, and being informed of this adventure, began to comfort Mr. O'Neill for the lady's elopement, observing that he seemed to have had a lucky escape, that it was better she should elope before than after marriage. The Hibernian was of a very different opinion. He said, if he had been once married, she might have eloped as soon as she pleased, he would have taken care that she should not have carried her fortune along with her. "Ah," said he, "she's a Judas Iscariot, and has betrayed me with a kiss, and, like Judas, she carried the bag, and has not left me money enough to bear my expenses back to London, and so I'm come to this pass, and the rogue that was the occasion of it has left you without a servant. You may put me in his place, and by Jesus, it is the best thing you can do." I begged to be excused, declaring I could put up with any inconvenience, rather than treat as a footman the descendant of Tyrone the Great. I advised him to return to his friend, Mr. Cosgrave, and take his passage from Newcastle by sea, towards which I made him a small present, and he retired, seemingly resigned to his evil fortune. I have taken upon trial a Scotchman, called Archie Mulpin, an old soldier, whose last master, a colonel, lately died at Berwick. The fellow is old and withered, but he has been recommended to me for his fidelity, by Mrs. Humphreys, a very good sort of a woman, who keeps the inn at Tweedmouth, and is much respected by all the travellers on this road. Clinker, without doubt, thinks himself happy in the removal of a dangerous rival, and he is too good a Christian to repine at Dutton's success. Even Mrs. Jenkins will have reason to congratulate herself upon this event, when she coolly reflects upon the matter, for, howsoever she was forced from her poise for a season, by snares laid for her vanity, Humphry is certainly the North Star to which the needle of her affection would have pointed at the long run. At present, the same vanity is exceedingly mortified, upon finding herself abandoned by her new admirer, in favor of another inamorata. She received the news with a violent burst of laughter, which soon brought on a fit of crying, and this gave the finishing blow to the patience of her mistress, which had held out beyond all expectation. She now opened all those floodgates of reprehension, which had been shut so long. She not only reproached her with her levity and indiscretion, but attacked her on the score of religion, declaring roundly that she was in a state of apostasy and reprobation, and finally, threatened to send her packing at this extremity of the kingdom. All the family interceded for poor Winifred, not even excepting her slighted swain, Mr. Clinker, who, on his knees, implored and obtained her pardon. There was, however, another consideration that gave Mrs. Tabitha some disturbance. At Newcastle, the servants had been informed by some wag, that there was nothing to eat in Scotland, but oatmeal and sheep's heads, and Lieutenant Lismahago being consulted, what he said served rather to confirm than to refute the report. Our aunt, being apprised of this circumstance, very gravely advised her brother to provide a sumpter horse with store of hams, tongues, bread, biscuit, and other articles for our subsistence, in the course of our peregrination, and Mr. Bramble as gravely replied, that he would take the hint into consideration, but, finding no such provision was made, she now revived the proposal, observing that there was a tolerable market at Berwick, where we might be supplied, and that my man's horse would serve as a beast of burthen. The squire, shrugging his shoulders, eyed her askance with a look of ineffable contempt, and, after some pause, "Sister," said he, "I can hardly persuade myself you are serious." She was so little acquainted with the geography of the island, that she imagined we could not go to Scotland but by sea, and, after we had passed through the town of Berwick, when he told her we were upon Scottish ground, she could hardly believe the assertion. If the truth must be told, the South Britons in general are woefully ignorant in this particular. What, between want of curiosity, and traditional sarcasms, the effect of ancient animosity, the people at the other end of the island know as little of Scotland as of Japan. If I had never been in Wales, I should have been more struck with the manifest difference in appearance betwixt the peasants and commonalty on different sides of the Tweed. The boors of Northumberland are lusty fellows, fresh-complexioned, cleanly, and well-clothed, but the labourers in Scotland are generally lank, lean, hard-featured, sallow, soiled, and shabby, and their little pinched blue caps have a beggarly effect. The cattle are much in the same style with their drivers, meagre, stunted, and ill-equipped. When I talked to my uncle on this subject, he said, though all the Scottish hinds would not bear to be compared with those of the rich counties of South Britain, they would stand very well in competition with the peasants of France, Italy, and Savoy, not to mention the mountaineers of Wales, and the redshanks of Ireland. We entered Scotland by a frightful moor of 16 miles, which promises very little for the interior parts of the kingdom, but the prospect mended as we advanced. Passing through Dunbar, which is a neat little town, situated on the seaside, we lay at a country inn, where our entertainment far exceeded our expectation, but for this we cannot give the Scots credit, as the landlord is a native of England. Yesterday we dined at Haddington, which has been a place of some consideration, but is now gone to decay, and in the evening arrived at this metropolis, of which I can say very little. It is very romantic, from its situation on the declivity of a hill, having a fortified castle at the top, and a royal palace at the bottom. The first thing that strikes the nose of a stranger shall be nameless, but what first strikes the eye is the unconscionable height of the houses, which generally rise to 5, 6, 7, and 8 stories, and, in some places, as I am assured, to 12. This manner of building, attended with numberless inconveniences, must have been originally owing to want of room. Certain it is, the town seems to be full of people, but their looks, their language, and their customs, are so different from ours, that I can hardly believe myself in Great Britain. The inn at which we put up, if it may be so called, was so filthy and disagreeable in all respects, that my uncle began to fret, and his gouty symptoms to recur, recollecting, however, that he had a letter of recommendation to one Mr. Mitchelson, a lawyer. He sent it by his servant, with a compliment, importing that we would wait upon him next day in person, but that gentleman visited us immediately, and insisted upon our going to his own house, until he could provide lodgings for our accommodation. We gladly accepted of his invitation, and repaired to his house, where we were treated with equal elegance and hospitality, to the utter confusion of our aunt, whose prejudices, though beginning to give way, were not yet entirely removed. Today, by the assistance of our friend, we are settled in convenient lodgings, up 4 pair of stairs, in the High Street, the 4th story being, in this city, reckoned more genteel than the first. The air is, in all probability, the better, but it requires good lungs to breathe it at this distance above the surface of the earth. While I do remain above it, whether higher or lower, provided I breathe at all, I shall ever be, dear Phillips, yours, J. To Dr. Lewis. Dear Lewis, that part of Scotland contiguous to Berwick, nature seems to have intended as a barrier between 2 hostile nations. It is a brown desert of considerable extent, that produces nothing but heath and fern, and what rendered it the more dreary when we passed, there was a thick fog that hindered us from seeing above 20 yards from the carriage. My sister began to make wry faces, and use her smelling bottle. Liddy looked blank, and Mrs. Jenkins dejected, but in a few hours these clouds were dissipated, the sea appeared upon our right, and on the left the mountains retired a little, leaving an agreeable plain betwixt them and the beach. But, what surprised us all, this plain, to the extent of several miles, was covered with as fine wheat as ever I saw in the most fertile parts of South Britain. This plentiful crop is raised in the open field, without any enclosure, or other manure than the alga marina, or seaweed, which abounds on this coast, a circumstance which shows that the soil and climate are favorable, but that agriculture in this country is not yet brought to that perfection which it has attained in England. Enclosures would not only keep the grounds warm, and the several fields distinct, but would also protect the crop from the high winds, which are so frequent in this part of the island. Dunbar is well situated for trade, and has a curious basin, where ships of small berth may be perfectly secure, but there is little appearance of business in the place. From thence, all the way to Edinburgh, there is a continual succession of fine seats, belonging to noblemen and gentlemen, and as each is surrounded by its own parks and plantation, they produce a very pleasing effect in a country which lies otherwise open and exposed. At Dunbar there is a noble park, with a lodge, belonging to the Duke of Roxburgh, where Oliver Cromwell had his headquarters, when Leslie, at the head of a Scotch army, took possession of the mountains in the neighborhood, and hampered him in such a manner, that he would have been obliged to embark and get away by sea, had not the fanaticism of the enemy forfeited the advantage which they had obtained by their general's conduct. Their ministers, by exhortation, prayer, assurance, and prophecy, instigated them to go down and slay the Philistines in Gilgal, and they quitted their ground accordingly, notwithstanding all that Leslie could do to restrain the madness of their enthusiasm. When Oliver saw them in motion, he exclaimed, "Praised be the Lord, he hath delivered them into the hands of his servant," and ordered his troops to sing a psalm of thanksgiving, while they advanced in order to the plain, where the Scots were routed with great slaughter. In the neighborhood of Haddington, there is a gentleman's house, in the building of which, and the improvements about it, he is said to have expended £40,000, but I cannot say I was much pleased with either the architecture or the situation, though it has in front a pastoral stream, the banks of which are laid out in a very agreeable manner. I intended to pay my respects to Lord Elibank, whom I had the honour to know at London many years ago. He lives in this part of Lothian, but was gone to the north, on a visit. You have often heard me mention this nobleman, whom I have long revered for his humanity and universal intelligence, over and above the entertainment arising from originality of his character. At Musselburgh, however, I had the good fortune to drink tea with my old friend Mr. Cardinal, and at his house I met with Dr. C., the parson of the parish, whose humour and conversation inflamed me with a desire of being better acquainted with his person. I am not at all surprised that these Scots make their way in every quarter of the globe. This place is but 4 miles from Edinburgh, towards which we proceeded along the seashore, upon a firm bottom of smooth sand, which the tide had left uncovered in its retreat. Edinburgh, from this avenue, is not seen to much advantage. We had only an imperfect view of the castle and upper parts of the town, which varied incessantly according to the inflections of the road, and exhibited the appearance of detached spires and turrets, belonging to some magnificent edifice in ruins. The Palace of Holyrood House stands on the left, as you enter the Cannon Gate. This is a street continued from hence to the gate called Netherbow, which is now taken away, so that there is no interruption for a long mile, from the bottom to the top of the hill on which the castle stands, in a most imperial situation, considering its fine pavement, its width, and the lofty houses on each side. This would be undoubtedly one of the noblest streets in Europe, if an ugly mass of mean buildings, called the Locken Booths, had not thrust itself, by what accident I know not, into the middle of the way, like Middle Row in Holborn. The city stands upon 2 hills, and the bottom between them, and, with all its defects, may very well pass for the capital of a moderate kingdom. It is full of people, and continually resounds with the noise of coaches and other carriages, for luxury as well as commerce. As far as I can perceive, here is no want of provisions. The beef and mutton are as delicate here as in Wales, the sea affords plenty of good fish, the bread is remarkably fine, and the water is excellent, though I'm afraid not in sufficient quantity to answer all the purposes of cleanliness and convenience, articles in which, it must be allowed, our fellow subjects are a little defective. The water is brought in leaden pipes from a mountain in the neighborhood, to a cistern on the Castle Hill, from whence it is distributed to public conduits in different parts of the city. From these it is carried in barrels, on the backs of male and female porters, up 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 pairs of stairs, for the use of particular families. Every story is a complete house, occupied by a separate family, and the stair being common to them all, is generally left in a very filthy condition. A man must tread with great circumspection to get safe housed with unpolluted shoes. Nothing can form a stronger contrast than the difference betwixt the outside and inside of the door, for the good women of this metropolis are remarkably nice in the ornaments and propriety of their apartments, as if they were resolved to transfer the imputation from the individual to the public. You are no stranger to their method of discharging all their impurities from their windows, at a certain hour of the night, as the custom is in Spain, Portugal, and some parts of France and Italy, a practice to which I can by no means be reconciled, for notwithstanding all the care that is taken by their scavengers to remove this nuisance every morning by break of day, enough still remains to offend the eyes, as well as other organs of those whom use has not hardened against all delicacy of sensation. The inhabitants seem insensible to these impressions, and are apt to imagine the disgust that we avow is little better than affectation, but they ought to have some compassion for strangers, who have not been used to this kind of sufferance, and consider whether it may not be worth while to take some pains to vindicate themselves from the reproach that, on this account, they bear among their neighbors. As to the surprising height of their houses, it is absurd in many respects, but in one particular light I cannot view it without horror, that is, the dreadful situation of all the families above, in case the common staircase should be rendered impassable by a fire in the lower stories. In order to prevent the shocking consequences that must attend such an accident, it would be a right measure to open doors of communication from one house to another, on every story, by which the people might fly from such a terrible visitation. In all parts of the world, we see the force of habit prevailing over all the dictates of convenience and sagacity. All the people of business at Edinburgh, and even the genteel company, may be seen standing in crowds every day, from 1 to 2 in the afternoon, in the open street, at a place where formerly stood a market cross, which, by the by, was a curious piece of Gothic architecture, still to be seen in Lord Somerville's garden. In this neighborhood, I say, The people stand in the open street from the force of custom, rather than move a few yards to an exchange that stands empty on one side, or to the Parliament Close on the other, which is a noble square adorned with a fine equestrian statue of King Charles II. The company thus assembled are entertained with a variety of tunes, played upon a set of bells, fixed in a steeple hard by, as these bells are well toned, and the musician, who has a salary from the city, for playing upon them with keys, is no bad performer. The entertainment is really agreeable, and very striking to the ears of a stranger. The public inns of Edinburgh are still worse than those of London, but by means of a worthy gentleman, to whom I was recommended, we have got decent lodgings in the house of a widow gentlewoman of the name of Lockhart, and here I shall stay until I have seen everything that is remarkable in and about this capital. I now begin to feel the good effects of exercise. I eat like a farmer, sleep from midnight till 8 in the morning without interruption, and enjoy a constant tide of spirits, equally distant from inanition and excess, but whatever ebbs or flows my constitution may undergo, my heart will still declare that I am, dear Lewis, your affectionate friend and servant, Matt. Bramble Dr. To Mrs. Mary Jones, at Brambleton Hall. Dear Mary, the Squire has been so kind as to wrap my bit of nonsense under the cover of his own sheet. Oh, Mary Jones. Mary Jones. I have had trials and tribulation. God help me. I have been a vixen and a griffin these many days. Satan has had power to tempt me in the shape of Van Ditten, the young squire's Wally de Shamble, but by God's grace he did not prevail. I thought as how there was no harm in going to a play at Newcastle, with my hair dressed in the parish fashion, and as for the trifle of paint, he said as how my complexion wanted touch, and so I let him put it on with a little Spanish owl, but a mischievous mob of colliers, and such promiscuous ribble-rabble, that could bear no smut but their own, attacked us in the street, and called me whore and painted Isabel, and splashed my clothes, and spoiled me a complete set of blonde lace triple ruffles, not a pin the worse for the wear. They cost me 7 good shillings, to Lady Griskin's woman at London. When I asked Mr. Clinker what they meant by calling me Isabel, he put the Bible into my hand, and I read of an Isabel a painted harlot, that was thrown out of a vendor, and the dogs came and licked her blood. But I am no harlot, and, with God's blessing, no dog shall have my poor blood to lick. Mary, heaven forbid, amen. As for Ditton, after all his courting, and his compliment, he stole away an Irishman's bride, and took a French leave of me and his master, but I value not his going a farting, but I have had hanger on his account. Mistress scolded like mad, though I have the comfort that all the family took my part, and even Mr. Clinker pleaded for me on his bended knee. Though, God he knows, he had reasons enough to complain, but he's a good soul, abounding with Christian meekness, and one day will meet with his reward. And now, dear Mary, we have got to Hattingborough, among the Scots, who are civil enough for our money, though I don't speak their lingo, but they should not go for to impose upon foreigners, for the bills in their houses say, they have different easements to let, and behold there is no ojeeks in the whole kingdom, nor anything for poor servants, but a barrel with a pair of tongs thrown across, and all the chairs in the family are emptied into this here barrel once a day, and at 10 o'clock at night the whole cargo is flung out of a back window, that looks into some street or lane, and the maids calls Gardyloo to the passengers, which signifies Lord have mercy upon you. And this is done every night in every house in Hattingborough, so you may guess, Mary Jones, what a sweet savour comes from such a number of perfuming pans, but they say it is wholesome, and, truly, I believe it is, for being in the vapours, and thinking of Isabel and Mr. Clinker, I was going into a fit of hysterics, when this fifth, saving your presence, took me by the nose so powerfully that I sneezed 3 times, and found myself wonderfully refreshed, and this to be sure is the reason why there are no fits in Hattingborough. I was likewise made believe, that there was nothing to be had but oatmeal and seeps' heads, But if I hadn't been a fool, I might have known there could be no heads without carcasses. This very blessed day I dined upon a delicate leg of Welsh mutton and cauliflower, and as for the oatmeal, I leave that to the servants of the country, which are poor drudges, many of them without shoes or stockings. Mr. Clinker tells me here is a great call of the gospel, but I wish some of our family be not fallen off from the right way. Oh, if I was given to tale-bring, I have my own secrets to discover. There has been a deal of huggling and flirtation betwixt mistress and an old Scotch officer, called Gizmicoggo. He looks for all the world like the scarecrow that our gardener has set up to fright away the sparrows, and what will come of it, the Lord knows, but come what will, it shall never be said that I mentioned a syllabub of the matter. Remember me kindly to Saul and the kitten. I hope they got the hornbuck, and will put it to a good use, which is the constant prayer of, dear Molly, your loving friend, Win. Jenkins, Edinburgh, July 8.